So, how does a billionaire get involved with a network that's devoted to an ice sport? Well, Howard Hughes was a multinational person. He had multinational companies, and the NHL network, which came out in 1975 and lasted for most of the late 1970s, was just that. Now, the NHL network, not to be confused with the Canadian TV channel, was an American TV syndication package that broadcast NHL games from 1975 to 76 through 1978-79. The NHL network was again distributed by the Hughes TV network on a myriad of channels in pretty well all the major markets. Now, after being dropped by NBC after the 75 season, a controversial decision because Peter Puck was without a job, the NHL had no national TV contract in the States. In response to this, the league put together a network of independent stations covering approximately 55% of the country, ironically not in Minnesota. Now, games typically aired on Monday nights, beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, or Saturday afternoons, where most of them were from the Garden or Madison Square Garden. The package was offered to local stations with no rights fees. Profits would be derived from the advertising, which is about evenly split between the network and the local station. The Monday night games were often billed as the NHL game of the week. Viewers in New York City, Buffalo, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and LA got the game of the week on a different channel than their local team's games. Therefore, whenever a team had a home game, the NHL network aired the home team's broadcast rather than their own. Initially, the Monday night package was marketed to ABC affiliates, the idea being that ABC carried Monday Night Football in the fall, and starting in May 76, Monday Night Major League Baseball. In the spring and summer, as such, stations would want hockey to create a year-round Monday night sports block, but it went over like a lead balloon as few ABC stations, besides those in the East Coast, picked up the package. Now, during the 76 season, the NHL Network showed selected games from the NHL Super Series. The big one in that package was Red Army at Philadelphia. However, the American broadcasts were dominant and teams. The package did not include probably the greatest hockey game of all time, Red Army at Montreal on New Year's Eve 75, which Montreal dominated in a 3-3 tie. Now, this contest was only seen on both languages on the CBC. It also broadcast some playoff games. During the 77 campaign, the NHL Network showed 12 regular season games on Monday nights, plus the All-Star contests. By 1979, the final season of the NHL Network's existence, there were 18 Monday night games and 12 Saturday afternoon games covered. And of course, the NHL adjusted their schedule to meet the need. Now, the 79 Challenge Cup replaced the All-Star game. It was a best-of-3 series between the NHL All-Stars against the Soviet Union national squad, won by the Soviets 2-1. Only the third period of Game 2, which won on a Saturday afternoon, was shown on CBS as part of the CBS Sports Spectacular. Unfortunately, CBS and their sponsors had a problem with the rink board advertising that the NHL sold at MSG and refused to allow them to be shown on TV. As a result, CBS viewers were unable to see the fire boards above the yellow kick plate. You can only see players' skates when the play moved to that side of the ice. Games 1 and 3 were shown on the NHL Network, where the advertising was no problem. Now, when Saturday afternoon games were added, the NHL said they would start at 1 p.m. and end by 4 ET. Markets with only 3 stations were reluctant to give up primetime programming slots. Ultimately, the plan failed, as not only did they not gain new markets, but many stations that already carried the Monday game didn't pick up the Saturday one. A few of the markets in the Eastern Time Zone that aired the Saturday afternoon games, including Boston, Buffalo, New York City, Washington, and ironically Springfield, Massachusetts, which was Hartford, Whaler, New England, Whaler country. In addition, the NHL gave stations the option of starting the Saturday afternoon broadcast at 1 Eastern Time or starting at 2, with the full open and a first period summary preceding the live action in the final 2 periods, similar to what CBC did on English Channel years before. Now, WDCA, the Washington, D.C. affiliate, and WWLP, the Springfield, Massachusetts affiliate, took that option. WPIG in Pittsburgh and WTCG in Atlanta didn't pick up the Saturday package, leaving their markets without Saturday coverage. WPIG and WTCG also showed the Monday games on tape delay at midnight and 11:30 p.m. respectively. Meanwhile, by 1978, WAB in Cleveland and WBFF in Baltimore dropped hockey coverage completely. Cleveland had lost his NHL team, the Barons, that year after just 3 seasons in that city, and which may have led WUAB to drop the package. Now, also in Buffalo, The Saturday afternoon games during January February were on WGR. Meanwhile, the Saturday games during March were on WTV. WTV carried the Monday Night Hockey package, while WGR was the over-the-air station for the Sabres. In New York, WAR did not carry Saturday games in January and February. Meanwhile, WNEW, also in New York, carried the March Saturday games at 2 p.m. in both Buffalo and New York. College basketball and World Championship tennis knocked the NHL off its usual Monday night carrier. Now, in 1978, KBGR Duluth picked up the Saturday afternoon package and dropped the Monday night games. In that season, WHMB in Indianapolis joined the network with Saturday afternoon games at 2 p.m. and Monday night games at 11 p.m. In addition, the Iowa PBS stations had dropped the NHL by this point. Freaky deaky, PBS, NHL on PBS, that was a thing for a while. Now, the 76 Stanley Cup Finals in the NHL Network marked the first time that the title series was nationally televised in its entirety in the States. When the NHL Network were broadcast playoff games in 76, Marv Albert split play-by-play duties with an announcer for one of the participating teams. For instance, on April 18th, Montreal and Chicago, it was Brad Palmer, who was the intermission host for Chicago Blackhawks telecast on WFLD 32, who split the play-by-play duties with Albert. Albert, the voice of the Rangers for a number of years, did play-by-play for the first and third periods, while Palmer did the second. Now, starting in 78, the NHL Network began simulcasting many games with Hockey Night in Canada. In these games, Dan Kelly, who was the NHL Network's lead play-by-play man, was assigned to do play-by-play along with HNIC color commentators that were presented, including Chico Retsch, Jerry Pinder, et al. Now, this, for example, happened in Game 7 of the quarterfinal series between the Maple Leafs and the Islanders, where Kelly teamed up with Brian McFarland, and of course, Toronto won an overtime goal by Lanny McDonald. Now, the entire 78 Stanley Cup Finals between the Habs and the Bruins, and the entire 79 title series between the Habs and Rangers were both simulcast as well. However, had that final gone to Game 7, then that game would have been broadcast on ABC. Now, commentator crews varied pretty much. In 76, the teams series showed Buffalo, New York, Philadelphia, Toronto, Montreal, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston. 77, you had the prelim rounds, Pittsburgh, Toronto, Philadelphia, Toronto in the quarters, Montreal Islanders and Philadelphia, Boston. In the 78 playoffs, Buffalo Rangers, quarters, Montreal, Detroit, Philly, Buffalo, and Islanders, Toronto. Semis, Montreal, Toronto, Boston, Philadelphia. That was a CBC feed. 79, the prelims, Buffalo, Pittsburgh. Quarterfinals, Boston, Pittsburgh. And the semifinals, Islanders, Rangers, and Montreal, Boston. And that campaign. Now, Stanley Cup Finals, commentator the games 1 and 4 in 76, games 1 and 4 in 77, games 1 to 6 in 78 based on the CBC feed, and 79 the CBC feed as well. Ironically, Chico Retsch had work color on the NHL Network before he changed over to Canada. Of course, the Islanders got knocked out in the playoffs in 78. That's what he got announced. And Kurt Bennett and Gary Unger did some announcing in 76. And Don Orey as well, and Unger were still there, and Makita as well, so it was a weird thing. So in most NHL cities, the used NHL affiliate was the same one that aired the local team's games. After about a couple of dozen other stations carried the contests, the network had 47 stations, including Atlanta, Baltimore, Boston, Buffalo, Charlotte, Chicago, Cleveland, Council Bluffs, Dallas, Denver, Des Moines, Detroit, Duluth, Galveston, Greenfield, Greensboro, Houston, Indy, Iowa City, LA, Miami, New York City, Omaha, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Red Oak, Rochester, San Francisco, Seattle, Sioux City, Springfield, St. Louis, and Washington. Now, ironically, Maine was left out, but probably because of the CBC feed across the border. Now, despite the presence of the Minnesota North Stars, there was no NHL Network affiliate in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Maybe it had to do with the the broadcast rights, with the local stations. Now, by the time the NBC's contract with the NHL ended, after a 75 season, they were getting 3.8 on a rating. Meanwhile, the ratings for the NHL Network in its first month of existence were 3-1 in New York, 1-9 in LA, and 1-3 in Chicago. By 79, the Monday night games were seen about 1 million viewers, 300,000 of which were in the Boston area. Also in 79, the 2 p.m. ET version of Saturday broadcast, with the first period cut out, was picked up by all participating affiliates except WSBK TV Boston, which carried the entire game. And often the cities where local teams were playing, the local station aired the NHL Network version of the game instead of a locally produced broadcast. Now, key announcers including NHL Network, not the CBC crews, Marv Albert, Fred Cusick, Ted Darling, mostly the Buffalo games, Don Earl, Jim Gordon, Gene Hart, Dan Kelly, Jiggs McDonald, Timmy Ryan, Sam Novar, Brad Palmer. Now, Marv Albert was the lead play-by-play man during their first season, in which he paired with a local guest announcer. That they typically would split play-by-play. Now, as previously mentioned, and for Game 4 of the 76 quarter final series between Montreal and Chicago, Albert and Palmer called the game. Albert handled the play-by-play for first and third, while Palmer, the Blackhawks' Stevie Host, handled play-by-play for the second period. Then in the process, acted as analysts for each other. It was played in Chicago, and the game was blacked out in the Chicago area, so go figure. Now, meanwhile, Albert also during the 76 playoff, teamed with Tim Ryan, who split play-by-play duties with Albert, and George Michael for Game 1 of the New York Islanders Buffalo series. And Terry Crisp, of all people, for Game 7 of the Toronto Maple Leafs Flyer series. Chris also worked alongside play-by-play man Gene Hart and Don Earl on Game 4 of the Toronto Philly mentioned above series. Now, in this thing, they were doing the Reggie Jackson, Tom Seaver, Jim Palmer, active players who were helping the announcing. Now, color, like we had mentioned, and this is a who's who, ladies and gentlemen. Donnie Orey, Kurt Bennett, Bill Chadwick, who just passed away recently, Terry Crisp, Gary Dornhofer, who did CBC, Phil Esposito, John Ferguson Sr., who would do CBC, eventually with the Jets, the great Eddie Jackman, Bobby Hull, which is kind of weird being a WHA player doing NHL commentary, Steve Jensen, the famous Jensen family, George Michael, Stan Mikita, Lou Nanny, who also worked with CBC, Bobby Orr, who sometimes worked with CBC, Chick Koresh, and Gary Unger. Now, the analysts for the 76 Stanley Cup Finals were active players, and each game featured different color commentators. Players, again, included Mikita, Unger, Rush, and Curly Bennett. The format concluded in 77 with Mikita, Gary Unger, Chico Resch, Don Orey replacing Kurt Bennett, who instead worked with Mal Albert and Dan Kelly on Game 4 of the Flyers-Boston Bruins playoff series. Now, what's, again, kind of freaky because, if I'm not mistaken, Gary Unger, Mikita, and Resch were in the playoffs that year. They lost first round, so it was sort of like going to Team Canada. Now, others that were involved included Dick Stockton, Scott Whale, Jim Simpson, and the greatest historian in NHL history, Stan Fischler. Now, Dick Stockton actually served as host for a season. Scott Whale was the studio host for 79 and 80. Meanwhile, Stan Fischler was on a broadcast as an intermission analyst to talk about the history. So again, it's kind of freaky because there was no mention by CBC that Dan Kelly was going to be taking Danny Gallivan's place, and Danny Gallivan called every game for the Stanley Cup Final in that decade of the 1970s, and so having Dan Kelly. But we're used to Dan Kelly because of his announcing. Through the years, he was a well-known voice. But by the way, what's missing in all this? Think for a second. No Bob Cole, right? So, so the greatest announcer of all time for hockey, Bob Cole, was not part of this package. So take it as you will. And this was for like Houston and Don Whitman. There was no Bill Hewitt as well. So I mean, pretty freaky. Do you take Gallivan? We'll take Bob Cole, but Bob was doing most of the Toronto games. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of the NHL Network. We've done previous podcasts and NHL packages. If we like what we're doing here, let us know in a like, comment, subscribe, or share. It is of its time, ladies and gentlemen, but like this is kind of weird because to call it the NHL Network, it's almost like not say the NHL network per se, because they weren't controlling the content. And I'm really not sure if Peter Puck was still being used. If anybody, because that's what NBC had created. Let me know if Peter Puck was around. But it's funny, they took over the NHL after the Goon period, which I think hurt ratings. But in Boston, I think that was the best benefit. They were getting 300 to 500,000 fans a game. And don't forget, now this is kind of freaky. CBC, some of the French CBC was deep in the border states, including Vermont, Maine, CBC French, because of Edmonton and the North Shore and Quebec across the Vermont border. So they're getting the games, but they were getting them in French. So this includes regular season and playoffs. CBC has a process right now, mostly, that are showing at least one game per night. I know Sportsnet doesn't do it as common, but back in the day in the NHL playoffs, they would show it all the way through. There could be as many as 28 games, give or take 20, close to 30, because some games were being played the same night. But one night was this game, so there could be 28 to 40 games in a postseason. Isn't that tremendous? That's what we call a saturation. Again, thanks for listening. As we like to say in the North Shore, Leafs lose again. Keep your stick on the ice. Bye.